Hello, and welcome to this IEEE Global Spec Engineering 360 webinar series. Today's presentation discusses the next frontier for medical device motion controllers. I'm David Wagman, Editorial Director of IEEE Engineering 360, and I'll be your host today. Performance Motion Devices' full line of advanced motion control solutions provide single and multi-axis motion control for brushless DC, DC brush, and step motors. Their world-class motion control ICs, boards, digital amplifiers, and digital drives give customers a wide range of solutions while providing unparalleled packaging flexibility. With PMD, you have access to a single family of motion control products which all speak their powerful and easy-to-use language, C-Motion. OEMs and engineering teams worldwide rely on their components to build automation and machinery with the highest performance, the highest reliability, and the lowest cost. Miniaturization allows a range of medical devices to be both portable and battery-powered. Advances in MOSFET and IGBT technology mean that motion controllers for brushless DC and DC brush motors also have grown smaller and less energy intensive. Motors are now so small that mere kilowatts of drive capacity are packed into a few cubic centimeters. Based on the premise that miniaturization is mission accomplished, what is the next big frontier for motion controllers? We'll explore this topic with a panel of industry experts who will help us trace the past, present, and, most important, the future of these devices, particularly in the medical equipment field. I'm pleased to have several experts joining me on our panel today. First, Dr. Gregory Fischer is a professor of mechanical and robotics engineering at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. He is a faculty member in mechanical engineering and robotics with an appointment in biomedical engineering. He received his PhD in mechanical engineering from Johns Hopkins University, where he was part of the NSF Engineering Research Center for Computer Integrated Surgery. At WPI, he has been an integral part of developing the robotics engineering program and teaches courses in robotics. He's also the founder of the Automation and Interventional Medicine Robotics Research Laboratory. Next is Kevin McCarthy, who's Chief Technology Officer for Dover Motion. He's got 35 years of experience on more than 1,000 positioning systems. He offers skills in all aspects of precision motion, encompassing their structure, guideways, motors, feedback devices, drives, and controls. He also has extensive knowledge in a variety of ancillary fields, including high vacuum systems, optics, fluidics, microscopy, and advanced metrology. He received a BS in physics from MIT and for many years ran one of the two private companies that now form Dover Motion. And Prabhakar Gaurisankranan is Vice President of Engineering and Strategy for PMD, Performance Motion Devices. He's responsible for future-proofing PMD and customers who innovate in a fast-paced technology environment. He holds a degree in electrical engineering and an MBA in finance and strategy from Babson College. Prab brings more than 20 years of technology and product management, hardware development, and engineering leadership to the PMD team. With that as just a brief introduction, I'd like to invite each one of our panel members to speak just a little bit more about their particular interest and some of the work that they have underway. And Greg Fischer, I wonder if you'd be able to take the first crack at that and tell us a bit more about what you have in your practice.
Sure, I would be happy to. So I said my name is Greg Fischer, and I'm a professor in the Robotics Engineering program at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. I'm also the director of the Automation Interventional Medicine Robotics Research Laboratory, where we do a lot of work in medical robotics. And I'm also the director of a brand new accelerator that we developed for medical cyber-physical systems funded by the state of Massachusetts called Practice Point here at WPI. And primarily my experience is involved with surgical robots, which includes things like image-guided surgical interventions, where we're trying to put robots inside of CAT scanners, MRI scanners, ultrasound scanners, you name it, and use it to very accurately target locations. We do a lot of work with more teleoperated surgical robots, where we're trying to essentially have motions mimic from the user input to the slave side, which is usually a patient side manipulator. And then we do wearable robotics, things like exoskeletons and assistive devices. And then in this new center, we're building out clinical care facilities co-located with engineering support so that we can actually work with companies and trying to essentially test out all these different types of medical devices in realistic settings.
Kevin McCarthy here, Chief Technology Officer for Dover Motion. We've been in the business of moving things back and forth at nanometer precision for decades, and really have an interesting historical context with PMD. That began with discussions with PMD's founder, Chuck Lewin, way back in 1992 when the company was launched. And we've also developed products over the years that used their ICs, which have continued to evolve. And we kind of got away from that with some very large flat panel and data storage systems in the early parts of this century, but we've regrouped in with a focus on life science and clinical diagnostic systems, and are again finding PMD products to be really valuable in that space. We do a lot in imaging applications, and generally speaking, and this is often microscopy, fluorescence microscopy, et cetera. And in those cases, the field of view is usually a lot smaller than the sample, so we need XY motion. And the depth of field is very, very small for the microscope objective, and so we need to focus it. So there's a focusing stage there on the left-hand part of the slide, and an XY stage in the middle. And then we do complete custom systems, occasionally up to and including cameras and illumination for our OEM customers.
Very nice. And Prab, I wonder if you could give a bit more background information on yourself and your particular expertise.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, David. This is Prab. As you can see in the slide, so I'm currently the VP of Engineering at PMD. PMD was founded in '92, mainly to try and solve motion control problems and try to be a trusted partner. So like the healthcare and life sciences, that's not their core expertise. So we like to be the invisible partners that make things move and work right. So if you look at the slide here, we help in a lot of different ways. We help to simplify the design and kind of accelerate their product development. We also try to provide end-to-end motion control solutions. So we start with modules, cards, ICs. So depending on their end application, they can pick and choose what they want to use. Our claim to fame is more advanced motion control. It's in terms of like S-curves and current loops and things that make the motor spin quieter, faster, and have better precise control. And what we're also known for is we still ship chips that were made in '92. So since we work with healthcare, semiconductor, and lots of different industries, long-term availability and support is key for being in this space.
And Prab, I'd like to stay with you as we begin our discussion today and ask you to bring us up to date on how we get to the state where we seem to be today, where we can say that miniaturization is something of mission accomplished, and maybe go back. I suppose we could start it in 1992, if you'd like, as kind of an easy sort of milestone with the founding of PMD, and walk us through some of the key technology developments that have happened over the years. What are some of the breakthroughs that have happened that allow us to get to the point of a discussion today where we're looking at miniaturization as something that's been achieved, and now we're moving on from that? I wonder if you could offer your perspective on that.
Sure. Yeah, one of the key things that everyone in this industry has leveraged is the development with the cell phones and miniaturization of the amount of logic and technology that can go into a chip. So that is kind of, like Kevin points out, we've gone from a shoebox-sized motion controller down to a motion controller the size of your fingernail. So we've kind of, obviously we didn't develop it, but we've leveraged technologies that have come along. And in parallel with that, you've seen lots of improvements in encoder technologies that, like Kevin pointed out, that led to nanometer scale precision, and other improvements that have come along that we've leveraged from other industries. So we've been able to kind of put together what's available, the latest and greatest at the time, and kind of make it part of the motion core. In terms of a historical perspective, Kevin probably has a lot more experience in this space. So Kevin, do you want to offer some perspective on what you've seen from when you started and through now at Dover?
Sure. We were really proud to be able to assist in providing voice of customer in the early days and nudging development towards supporting, for example, sinusoidal commutation and sinusoidal encoder interpolation. So because we're exposed to really demanding super high precision applications, we've been able to share with PMD our requirements, and they've been pretty effective over the years in incorporating those into their ICs.
And Greg, do you have anything that you'd like to add? Any additional perspective on progress up until now?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of really interesting progress, especially related to the idea of bringing more power to the microcontroller. So coming from a robotics perspective, you really need to think about things like coordinated motion between axes. And in some of our earlier control systems that we've developed or that we've worked with, it was a bit challenging because you can get very, very high precision on a joint level axis, but if you want to start having coordinated motions over essentially a task space type motion with an articulated robot, it's super critical to have synchronized motion between these. And now that we're even starting to get into things like cooperative motion or real-time tracking based off of imaging, you don't even necessarily have pre-planned trajectories that you can use. So this idea of putting more and more processing power on the chips, I think, is really opening up the doors to some really innovative new technologies and approaches we can take.
Yeah, and I'll second that. It's we're almost spoiled at the computational potency that is now available in servo control ICs such as PMD provides. There's an enormous amount of power there, and it's kind of a bit of a war between what we require and what's available in the silicon, but it's worked out pretty well.
We can talk in a little bit more detail about imaging and, in particular, applications in the life sciences sector. I wonder, Greg, and then following up perhaps with Kevin and Prabha, if you'd like to also, if we can discuss a little bit some of the challenges, some of the deeper challenges that come about given the requirement for precise motion control for these types of life science applications. Greg, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, first, I think I'd just like to set the stage in terms of what really falls under the scope of that. The first part of this is really high precision motion for performing imaging and actually creating the images themselves, whether it's concatenating images together or whatnot. And that's something that I'm sure Kevin can address. And the other side of this is actually what do we do with these images once we get them? So for example, if you're going to be having robotic systems that are trying to track objects tracked by a camera, or robotic systems that are inside a medical imager, such as an ultrasound or a CAT scan or an MRI, so that we really can precisely track the objects dynamically and move towards them, it's really critical that we can have these motion controllers that are able to take this input that could be coming in at very, very high speeds and use that to adapt the motion profile or the motion trajectory. So I really just wanted to get across the point that, when we start thinking about using motion control and imaging, there's really these two different ends of the spectrum of both creating the imaging and then also what can we do once we're inside of this imaging system. And I think I'll hand it over to Kevin, who can talk about the precision motion needs of what you do to actually generate these images.
Sure. So generally speaking, when we look at imaging, there are three core requirements. The first is for what we call sequential field imaging, which is where you're acquiring an image while stationary and then moving as fast as possible to the next field of view. This might be on the order of a millimeter away. And the requirement there is to acquire those images with the motion taking the least amount of time. So it pushes you towards very fast move and settle. And depending upon the resolution of the system, the settling can be to as tight as 50 nanometers. There's another variant of imaging which involves constant velocity scanning. And in that case, the requirement is to move at super constant velocity. And any deviations from that affect the quality of the image. And then the last bit is that you have to stay in focus for all of this imaging. And that generally involves moving a microscope objective up and down, often under the control of a laser autofocus system at high bandwidth with very, very high resolution. And altogether, in DNA sequencing, for example, you're looking at billions of clonal objects that might be on a half-micron pitch. And the goal is to get as much of those objects imaged as possible. So it's all about throughput, and throughput really drives system dynamics.
Yeah, and this is Prab. Yeah, just to add to Greg and Kevin's, so some of these inputs, like Kevin was saying, where we've gotten requirements that look tougher on paper, that have driven a lot of innovation at PMD. So we've kind of helped us get into path planning, kind of doing multi-point moves and fast acceleration, deceleration, more precision have all been driven out of these. And we've also kind of built out this C-Motion, like an SDK platform where you can add more and more sophistication in the user code that gets tied back to a lot of metrics that you can collect from the actual motion controller. So that way they can kind of image at the right spot and do a lot of advanced functionality, which is on top of the motion part of it.
And just a reminder to our live day audience that we are happy to take your questions and address them. So feel free to send us your questions, and we will put them in the queue and get to as many of them as we can. Kevin and Greg, let me ask if we could talk a little bit about centralized versus decentralized controllers. And I wonder if you could both spend a little bit of time talking about what the key differences are and factors to consider in distributed control architecture. Kevin, would you like to begin with that?
Sure. So there's two fundamental paradigms of how you go about controlling a multi-axis system. The traditional approach is that there's a single place where all the motion control electronics lies. Could be the size of a footlocker, takes up a lot of space in the instrument, and then a spaghetti set of cables extend out from that central brain and power source to each of the axes. Since many of those axes are moving, you've got lots of moving cables, it's all a little tricky. You also have to get information to and from the axis from the controller at high speed with high fidelity. Now, the alternative architecture, one of decentralization, is one where the intelligence lies at each axis. One of the benefits of that is that the distances between that decentralized element to the motor, to the encoder, to limit switches is in some cases a matter of centimeters. And because it's a single axis, it can be very compact. So the controller, the footlocker vanishes. You barely see the controller at the axis, but this does require that you have some sort of means of doing distributed communication to keep everybody going where they're supposed to go. And both the Ethernet and CAN interfaces that PMD provides are very helpful in this regard.
Greg, would you like to add a bit to that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that's always a fundamental discussion when we're building systems, because we're involved in making so many different types of robots for various different applications. And how much intelligence or control do you want to have, per axis versus having centralized, right? And what we find a lot of times is things that are interacting with the user. So we do a lot of work with haptics, force feedback, continuously updated motions, and having at least position control, velocity control, or especially things like force control or current control at the axes, running at very, very high speeds on a real-time system can give you very good performance. And then you can have your more centralized controller can generally be running at lower rates. So for example, if you're taking in data from an optical or magnetic tracking system, or taking in data from a medical imaging system, or taking in data from a camera, those things are happening at much lower rates than the typical servo update rates. And there you can be using a computer, and that's very important when we start getting to this multi-axis articulated motion. It might not be as critical for Cartesian type motions, but if you need to be on the fly calculating things like the Jacobian that relates, I want to apply a force vector in a certain direction from the tip of my robot, I need to be doing some pretty significant math calculations every millisecond or so, and that way you can have these calculations happening on a computer, and then you can start having the actual force controllers, the torque controllers, happening at even higher speeds at the axes. That being said, there's definitely a push, and now having more and more intelligence, we're starting to get to the point where we can have these ARM-based microcontrollers even running real-time Linux right near the axes, and we're starting to put, for example, robot forward and inverse kinematics right into these low-level real-time motion control systems. So I think there's definitely an interesting shift here that's just starting to happen, where you don't necessarily need to have a full computer doing all of these high-level calculations, because even for some very complex robots, we're able to push it down to microcontrollers, pretty advanced microcontrollers, so microcontrollers right at the axes now.
Rob, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think at PMD we are architecture agnostic. We kind of support either option. We have a single 4-axis chip that helps do the centralized version really well, where the synchronization happens between the axes within the chip. We also have a single-axis chip that kind of helps you do this, where you have the controller, right? Controller, encoder, and motor are all encapsulated together, and they can talk with each other over CAN or Ethernet or any of the faster interfaces. So we kind of are agnostic, but we enable both end applications.
And Prab, as Greg outlined a bit, the motion controllers are getting smarter and collecting more data. And the question is, who should have access to this data? Are there security precautions that we should be taking in order to ensure privacy for motion controllers that record things like motor performance data that are used directly for patient treatment or to analyze test results in the laboratory? I want you to talk a little bit about some of those privacy and security issues.
Yeah, we are actually we were actively looking at IIoT for supporting collection of data, because obviously we being the controller, we are right at the motor, and we get a lot of information, right, as we do our position loop and current loop. So we're collecting a lot of useful data. That's not much is being done with it now. But hopefully in the future, as the trend that we see is, as you collect this data, you're able to kind of upload it over a faster interface like Ethernet to a secure server, and where there's higher, like Greg pointed out, higher level algorithms and crunching that happens on the data to make something useful out of it. So what we feel on the controller side is more being the conduit to collect the data and securely over Ethernet transport it to a secure server that then the end user or OEM can decide how they want to handle it.
Sure, and
Greg,
this is Greg here.
On security? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to actually. This is actually a very significant issue, especially in the field of medical devices, where I focus more on the interventional medical devices and things that are interacting with folks on a day-to-day basis as well. And in fact, that's one of the core focus areas of our center, and why the state wanted to put some resources into this so we can actually be testing things like cybersecurity. So the one side of it is the data, and how do we make sure the data is secure, and that's both the motion control data and then, of course, all the image data that you're acquiring. And the other side of this is, how do you make sure that the input coming into this isn't being corrupted? You could imagine on a surgical robot, for example, somebody intercepting the signals, changing them, and suddenly compromising the way a procedure is performed. And today, a lot of times, the standard of care is just pretty much make sure your devices aren't connected to the internet while you're actually performing the procedures, which, up until now, that might not have been a big deal, but as robots are getting more intelligent, as we're trying to have more remote teleoperation and manipulation, that clearly is not going to fly. So this is a huge challenge right now, is to ensure both the safety of the data coming in and the integrity of the data coming in, and then making sure we can securely store and transmit the data coming out, And then the other side of this is also interoperability between different devices, because especially on the medical device side, you're going to be plugging into a hospital network potentially, and all sorts of different data from all sorts of different vendors are all coming together, and how can we try to both standardize this and still make sure it stays secure?
Great. Just a reminder that today's webinar is dealing with the next frontier for medical device motion controllers. And my guests include Dr. Greg Fischer from Worcester Polytechnic Institute, Kevin McCarthy from Dover Motion, and Prabhakar Gaurisandrakan from PMD. And I wonder, Greg, if we could stick with you for a minute to offer some comments, and Kevin and Prabh also, I'd like you to weigh in on this. To offer your thoughts on the range of interfaces that can be used to interact with controllers, and talk a bit about the pros and the cons of each one of these as you go along. Greg, would you like to start with that?
Sure, absolutely. And again, being more on a research setting, we always end up in this situation of, do we want something that's potentially better and more compact and more stable for a deployed type device, or what do we want that's more helpful for development purposes? So a lot of times we end up looking into platforms that are possibly more modular, more easier to develop for the research side of things. But in terms of what we actually deploy, we typically are doing things like programming in C and C++. We're working on real-time operating systems. So having the ability to communicate with nice APIs and libraries on the motion controllers themselves, to integrate with the motion controller chips or interface with the amplifiers, that's really important in my mind for deployed devices. But on the other side of the coin, I think having flexibility in how you do these interfaces really, really helps with accelerating the prototyping and R&D. And that's not just in an academic setting, but also in a commercial setting where you want to create mock-ups and get concepts in front of key opinion leaders. Being able to rapidly deploy and rapidly develop systems is really important. So I think it's very important to have variable different ways that we can interface both physically and the way that we can program these different types of motion controllers.
And chiming in from my end, there's a variety of ways that you can interface with motion controllers. A common one is a 2-letter or so ASCII character string. Another is to sort of have a built-in BASIC-like language. And a third is to have an API with a rich language of a rich library of C calls, such as C motion. And what we find is that folks who are just going to buy a couple and don't have a lot of time to spend on this prefer sort of the simpler interfaces, ASCII characters, but our primary focus is on OEM accounts. And in that case, they have the programming resources and seem to really appreciate the C language interface, where they can just write flexibly using established calls that are provided by the PMD library.
This is Prab chiming in. Yeah, I think what we're seeing more and more is these large medical OEMs like to standardize on a common motion control board that they'll take, let's say, one of our chips and put it into their own board and use it across lots of different platforms. So for them, C motion is critical. So if you want to get a new application started, they already have the card developed and they have most of the software written. And so they just have to do tweaks to the library and add new procedures, new function calls to do some of the advanced stuff. So it actually helps. What they find is they're able to build a library of function calls and stuff that gets them 90% there through their project. So they're able to get to market a lot faster with C motion and these standard motion boards that they build out of RICs. So they can really go into production much quicker.
Very good. And a reminder to our live day audience that we're happy to take your questions and consider them with the panel. We have one. I'm going to just toss out to our 3 panel members and see who wants to grab it first. The question is, when it comes to medical device motion controls, CAN and EtherCAN are 2 dominant field buses. What is your opinion on the pros and cons of these 2, and what do you see as the future trend on field bus? Who would... Rob, do you want to take a shot at that first?
Sure. I'm sure Kevin can add to it. It's what we see is there's a lot of open standards. So we're trying at PMD. We try to stay with the more common mainstream standards. So that's what we kind of support: Ethernet and CAN and SPI that are more universal. What we see some like EtherCAT and a few others used is in a much larger factory-like setting with distributed controllers that are wired over long distances. But in a medical device and health science application, it's what we've seen more used is CAN or Ethernet or SPI more than EtherCAN. We also have a PRP, a custom protocol that runs on CAN, so that you can tune your motor and your application using a software, a ProMotion software that we provide for tuning their application, and then we put out C-Motion APIs, and that minimizes the amount of work that you have to do on the protocol side, so it helps you interface to standard interfaces like CAN and Ethernet. So we tend to see more smaller machines which have CAN or SPI more than EtherCAN.
Yeah, and from my perspective, we do see both CAN and SPI, but in addition, we have a number of customers who are quite comfortable using RS-485 as a multi-drop network of a sort, lower speed, but suitable for those needs.
Yeah, and then this is Greg here. I would tend to concur with that. Usually we use serial communications for the local interfaces, so when everything is sitting inside one box, we usually use SPI, but we've also used CAN. But it's very common for us to have multiple different control boxes communicating with each other, often in rooms next to each other. In fact, in some of my applications where we're putting devices in an MRI scanner, we actually use fiber optic converters, and we pass fiber optic Ethernet cables back and forth between rooms. So I think Ethernet and Ethernet-based approaches are very, very useful when you start having multiple discrete controllers and potentially various different multiple discrete controllers that need to be readily connected to each other, because you can use relatively standard, I mean, there's industrial level, but that's relatively standard switching gear to interface between a lot of different boxes.
Rob, let's start to talk about the future a little bit, and I'd like you to open the discussion and talk a little bit about what some of the key new technology developments are that we're seeing in medical applications that require more advanced motion control. What are you seeing right now? What's coming down the pike?
Yeah, actually, we see a lot of new encoder technologies like optical encoder and high precision encoders that Kevin can probably talk to a lot more. We're also seeing, like Greg was talking about, where what they want is, apart from the motion controller at the axis, they want it to have an embedded microprocessor that they can download user code, that they can customize stuff that are repetitive, but that are doesn't have to go in the standard chip. So there's an add-on processor that's built into some of these controllers. That's the trend that we're seeing, where an end OEM is building a card which has a microprocessor or a controller. So we are working on some future ICs that will kind of integrate some of these things together. We are also obviously seeing trends in terms of people starting to talk a lot about collecting data and predictive analytics, trying to see when the motor will fail before it fails. So that's where we're seeing the use cases for IoT and Ethernet. We're also starting to see some old trends come back, like you're seeing some stepper servo applications come back into limelight, because in some cases cost becomes a critical issue. So we've seen progression in lots of different fronts.
If I could chime in on that last comment, all too often people conclude that steppers are a thing of the past. But in fact, they are simple, they are cheap, they are endemic, they are stiff, and they will always be there. And they actually vastly outnumber servos. Fortunately, PMD supports all three motor types, but steppers will be around for a long time to come.
And Greg, what are you seeing in your lab?
Sure. So Prab touched on sensors and new sensor technology, and in particular, you mentioned encoders. But I think what's really coming down the pike more often is this idea of sensor fusion, where you have multiple ways to assess different aspects of a device. And again, in particular, in the robotics applications, you might have a combination of potentiometers and encoders. In fact, in medical devices, there's often redundancy where you are, in fact, in some cases, required to have multiple approaches. You may have medical imaging, you may have cameras, you might have IMUs, you might have external tracking systems. So how do we actually get the data from all of these different sources and concatenate it? So having, for example, motor interfaces that can get that encoder data out, we can get it into a processor. We can, for example, fuse data from, let's say, an IMU or a tracking system and imaging data, and then use that to estimate where you are and where you need to go, how fast you're going, things like that. So I believe the idea of using more and more sensors and how to intelligently combine the data from those sensors and then use that to update your motion control plans is really going to be key.
I want to get to standards in just a minute, but let's stick with and talk a little bit more about encoder and sensor technology. And I'm wondering, maybe Greg, you can take the first stab at this, and then Kevin, I think you have some insight into this as well. Has encoder and sensor technology improvements, have those improvements kept up with demanding medical application requirements? What do you see there, Greg?
Well, honestly, I'd love to see high resolution, very compact, very cheap, absolute encoders. But I don't think I've found a way to get all of those at once, unfortunately. But we've been using some newer encoder technologies, in particular high resolution reflective encoders are becoming more and more popular and more reasonably priced. And that kind of thing lets us have much more compact devices. Starting to use absolute encoders where we can make a lot of sense, especially for medical applications, because obviously if you have a patient or somebody that's in the way, you can't be going through a homing procedure, for example, and hitting limit switches or maybe not trusting potentiometers. So the idea of really compact sensors and or absolute encoders that have sufficient precision, I think, is really going to be a game changer for some of these medical robotics applications.
Kevin, what are you saying?
Any closed-loop system can't function without feedback. And while there are certainly magnetic encoders, and they have their place, optical encoders are really the core technology. And we've seen over the last decades how the resolution has just gotten finer and finer and finer. We do systems today where the resolution is, for example, 20 picometers, when the classical van der Waals diameter of the aluminum atom is 320. So there is essentially infinite resolution at our disposal, and that is quite valuable. More importantly, that used to, in the past, require somewhat bulky encoder readheads and bulky interpolators, and they were both very expensive. But today, we have modern opto ASICs that are very, very small, that are very effective reflective encoders. We also have very advanced and very compact and very affordable encoder interpolation technology. So that focusing stage that was in slide 5, that has a resolution of 1.25 nanometers. It has a position stability of about 3 nanometers RMS. And in its longer travel cousins, we can take that up to 2 meters per second. So encoders have come an enormous long way. And in addition, very recently, and Greg, we could share some information on this after the call, but absolute reflective optical encoders in inexpensive, compact opto-ASIC form have become available. And so absolute encoders, as Greg mentioned, are certainly important for super high reliability where homing routines can't be performed. But there's still a role for incremental encoders because as you really try to push precision, there is an issue called cyclical error, and that is an encoder problem that happens every period. And we've developed some pretty advanced Fourier decomposition methods to essentially eliminate it. So the encoder technology field is hopping, and we're taking advantage of every bit of it. It's again, at one level, we're all spoiled these days.
Yeah, and I think to Greg's point, Greg and Kevin's point on the absolute encoders, what we're also seeing is with the increased adoption of absolute encoders, we're seeing new serial formats to connect to encoders, like SSI and BIS. This is a European, it's more common in Europe, but it's a serial interface that you can connect to multiple encoders on one bus. That lets you have few pins and can talk to a lot of different encoders. So we're seeing trends in terms of physical interfaces that can support absolute encoders. So we support both, and so we see that trend too.
Let's talk for a minute, if we could, about standards and maybe get some idea of what the primary standards that design engineers need to be aware of and what the primary focus of current standards development for the sector looks like. Who would like to address that?
Probably Kevin can talk about on his side, and then Greg and I can add it.
Yeah, that's not so much my cup of tea, but maybe Greg, you can chime in.
Sure. I think it's really important that we have good standards for assessing different types of systems. So I gotta say I'm not a guru across the board on all different motion control standards that are going to apply, but I'm actually on some committees now, including one working on standards for assessing, for example, MRI-compatible robots, because it found everybody was reinventing the wheel and coming up with their own sets of tests. Nothing was comparable relative to each other. So I can absolutely vouch for the necessity to have standard ways to assess performance and assess accuracy and things like that. In terms of standards that we have to stick to, you can think of things like ISO 1345 and whatnot for medical devices. And in those cases, we really need to have very careful design controls. And the idea of having independent modular systems, for example, the kinds of things that PMD makes where we have these separate components, that allows you to have, aside from the fact that they're long-term stable, you can, by modularizing it, you can essentially minimize the amount of rework that needs to be done when you're going through your design control process and making changes. So that if you need to, for example, update a system, you can be very clear about what that system is touching upstream and downstream, and it's going to be able to limit your validation, for example, to a much smaller set than trying to revalidate your entire medical device, for example. So there are definitely some things to keep in mind when you're doing your development to keep in line with existing standards.
Yeah, and this is Prab. I think we are also seeing, obviously, from the physical interface point of view, there's a lot of standards, right? Like the encoders, they're trying to standardize on SSI or BIS so that you can buy an encoder from any manufacturer, hook it up to a controller. So there's a lot of physical interface standards, obviously Ethernet and CAN, that help you can interchange motors, encoders, and controllers.
And given this, medical device design can be relatively sticky once the FDA approval is gained. What are some of the consequences of the stickiness of the technology, and what are some of the drawbacks that need to be managed? Prab, can you talk a little bit about that, and Kevin and Greg also?
Yeah, I think what we typically see, like Greg pointed out, the main thing is, one thing we see is the design process, is how repeatable is your process in all the way from design through production. So every device that they get is the same. But we also kind of see this in terms of, it takes a while for a medical device to get designed, obviously the FDA process, and then once it's in the field, the availability of your chips and modules are critical. So you can't redesign anything. It has to be the exact same thing that they qualified with. So working with a vendor that can kind of support the same chips for a long term is key, because the new semiconductor industry, as you see, there's a ton of consolidation. So we see that even in our boards. Some of the chips that we design get aged out just because two companies merge. So those are some of the key concerns that they have in terms of the medical side of things.
Yeah, and while there's enormous benefits to having a sticky design win, that is to say you get to sell it for many years, inevitably technology moves on, and you find yourself 10 or 15 years after it launched, desperately wishing you could do it over and not being allowed to. So, but revenue, yes, but it can curtail the pace of innovation once they've frozen the design.
Greg, is that an issue that you touch on in the work that you do?
Yeah, and I think it's already been touched on both my previous point and what Prab said, but modularity is really key. That's one of the reasons I like some of these products from PMD, and then we've also developed our own motion control platforms, and we always ensure that they're as modular as possible. We have different components working on different aspects. Each one can be independently validated and verified. We can have different components that combine with other ones, that will have different motion axis cards, and over the years we keep coming up with different types of motion control axes. For example, we actually create our own motion controllers for piezoelectric motors. And we can essentially, every time a new motor comes out that we want to try, we can create a new card, for example, that drops into our robot, nothing else, and the entire system needs to change, not the communication protocols, not the control loops, anything other than maybe some gains that are set in software. So I think modularity is really, really key, especially in medical devices, because there you don't have to change a significant portion of the system or the device as you're, for example, adding new features, or over time you may want to upgrade something, because it is unfortunate in the med device space, things do often lag behind because you would have to go through an entire essentially revalidation process if you're going to be doing upgrades to the systems. And that's also why, for example, as Fred mentioned, having long-term stability is really, really critical, because once you do put this into place and get it into production and for sale, the last thing you want it to do is change your design purely because you can't find that part. If you have a reason why you want to do an upgrade, that's one thing, but to have to do it because you can no longer source a part is clearly not appropriate.
And Greg, let me stick with you and talk just a little bit about the industrial Internet of Things. There's a lot of talk about IoT and how it might affect motion control. Specific to medical devices, how likely do you think we are to see IoT being used in that sector? Any thoughts there?
Sure. I think this really comes down to having, lots and lots of different devices providing, input. And medical devices is obviously, very broad. In the surgical applications, generally you have self-contained, well-validated systems. But if this extends to how do you have devices in the home that are helping somebody, extend their ability to, live and work in their own, in their own home, you may have all sorts of sensors around the house. You may have fall detection sensors. You may have sensors to determine where somebody is. You're going to have devices that are dispensing pills. You may have robots that are going and grabbing things out of cabinets or helping them, and they're all going to need to interact with each other, and it's very likely these are all going to be coming from different vendors, potentially having different network interfaces. So how we get all of these devices to communicate with each other, both standards in terms of how they communicate, how we do cybersecurity. As I mentioned earlier, cybersecurity is really critical, both on how you control the device and also how you get data out of it, especially if it's a device that's physically interacting with somebody. So, this idea of interconnectivity of medical devices and how we can get multiple devices to interact reliably with each other from different vendors, potentially using different communication protocols, possibly using different physical interfaces, and ensuring security, I think is going to be a major challenge moving forward, because especially in the med device field, everybody likes to have, essentially their own proprietary interfaces in a lot of cases, with a few exceptions.
Yeah, I think
Rob,
when we look at IoT, at least from a motion controller point of view, right, we are tied to the motor and we get so much data. Just on the control loops, you see when a motor is starting to fail. So there's a big untapped area where you can do a lot of predictive analytics, even on simple stuff like your dialysis machine or something simple, which is a go, no-go, which helps someone go in and maintain or change out a part before the big MRI machine goes down for a week. So I personally feel like those kind of simple things would probably, low-hanging fruit would get used first before we go to more advanced networked kind of stuff. But there's a lot of situations where we collect we could collect very, very useful data that could be used in predictive analytics.
And how likely are we to achieve a true failure prediction with medical devices and machinery in, say, the next 5 years? What are the impediments, and how likely do you think that is?
Yeah, I think to Greg's point, the key is how standardized are these machines. Every machine has different interfaces. I think collecting data is probably the simpler problem. Is how do you upload that data, and what does the user do with that data is the key. It's how can they simplify it. So that's what we keep talking about here, is having standard interfaces where we can kind of upload it to an AWS server or something where you're doing more advanced algorithms and coming out with intelligent, actionable things that you can do with the data.
Sure, and
Kevin,
one vantage point on that is that in many of these cases, the motions are the same over and over and over again. So during the motion, you have what's called a profile of following error, which is exactly how far were you from the trajectory you should have followed. And when the mechanics are new and well lubricated and clean, that follows sort of an optimum and minimal following error profile. And as time goes on and they rust and degrade and get dirty and wear, that changes. And so that's a really core predictive thing is, hey, things are not quite going the way they used to. Something must be wrong. Let's compare the profile of the original machine to the profile of 6 months ago and the profile of today. And we can infer that something's going wrong, and in another 6 months, it's going to fail utterly and alert the appropriate individuals.
And Greg, is any of your work related to failure prediction? And
yeah, and actually what I wanted to address is more where I wish it would go. So in another life, I implemented a whole networked statistical process control system where we were looking at production machinery over an entire factory floor, having everything with custom interfaces that then connected into the LAN for the system, and we were collecting data and then doing predictive analytics and trying to understand when a process was going out of spec. And I think in a manufacturing setting, that's very, very common. That's something that, to my understanding, in medical setting, especially in the medical device type setting for individual devices, such as a robot in an operating room, that kind of thing is not really going on to the best of my knowledge. And that's why I think it'd be very valuable to start doing these types of assessments that, for example, Kevin and Prab were mentioning of looking at the motion profiles of these devices as they're working in, for example, an operating room, and using that to predict when something's going to fail. Rather than, for example, having instruments on a surgical robot that have a limited lifetime based on some arbitrary counter, right? Why not be able to, for example, predict when the motion profile is not going the way you think it is, or the forces are different, or the backlash is different than you'd expected. So I think there's some huge advantages in the medical device space once we can start doing these types of predictive analytics that have existed, quite frankly, in the manufacturing setting for quite some time.
Greg, let me stick with you for another minute and ask you to offer some insight into some of the new developments in motion control technology in the areas of things like robotics and exoskeletons or artificial limbs that can help people who suffer from muscular or neurological problems that affect their mobility. What are some advancements that you see coming along? And Prab and Kevin, I'd appreciate your comments there as well. But Greg, would you like to start us on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, my research really falls into two thrusts: surgical robots and assistive or wearable devices. So in this field of exoskeletons, we're getting into this new such a modality, if you will, of people wearing robots, and the motion profile that these robots need to follow is adaptive. It's not like you're going to program a pre-programmed gait into somebody, at least not in the exoskeletons that are coming on the market or going to be coming on the market soon. We need to be looking at things like people's EMG data or inertial measurement units, or in some case we actually have a LiDAR system that can look at the terrain in front of you and modify your gait as you're walking. So these are cases where we really need to have all sorts of sensor data, trying to determine, how the motion profile should behave, and doing this dynamically and updating the, for example, for an exoskeleton, the gait pattern that you're walking on. And simultaneously, we're also looking at the motor forces or torques and trying to assess, how much assistance does the user need. So if we're doing a force control loop, we can understand how much additional force or torque do we need to get that particular motion profile. And that gives us a lot of information about how well the person is walking and how much help do we need to provide them. And I think this is a very different modality of, robots in the past were pretty much you put them in an enclosure and don't touch them, right, and keep away. Whereas now we really need to get these systems that are interacting safely, but also updating their motion plans as the person is moving and as they're interacting. And similarly, on the surgical side of things, it's not about taking a pre-planned trajectory and following it. The future and why we're doing procedures inside an MRI scanner, for example, is we're getting live image updates. And as you perform a procedure, the anatomy changes. For example, if you're doing neurosurgery, the brain can swell just like, if you got hit in the arm, right, if you start poking needles into it. Plus, things swell as you start drilling holes and modifying tissues. So things are not necessarily where they were, and you need to use live image updates, and we need to use intelligence to update the motion profiles in real time for these robots to get very precise, very well coordinated motion, because these are generally articulated robots, and do so while we have reliable and fast updates to the motion control platforms.
Yeah, we're not really an exoskeleton place. We're not even really a robotics place. We pretty much do boring Cartesian X, Y, Z, or as we describe it in the utter simplification, we move things back and forth. However, we do so at very high precision, at very high throughput, and what we're looking for moving forward is the ability to leverage increased computational potency to put more and more elaborate loops in a smaller and smaller space, low RDS on MOSFETs, and basically what we're interested in doing is driving performance and miniaturization in the servo control system. And the future is very bright in that regard.
And I think to Greg and Kevin's point, so what we are seeing, the trend, what we're trying to support is have like a low-level motion controller that can do all your current loops and position loops fast and accurate, but also have an assist with a micro that sits right next to it, that's all in one chip, that kind of does some of the advanced stuff that at a slower pace, but can kind of integrate higher-level decisions, like Greg was pointing out. So those are the trends that we're seeing in terms of trying to be able to provide for these tougher use cases.
Well, I'm afraid that we're going to have to wrap up the webinar right there. I hope that everyone found the exchange valuable today. I'd also like to thank our presenters for taking part in this panel discussion. I hope you found value in what we've been discussing today, and I look forward to having you join us soon for another live IEEE Engineering 360 webinar. Visit us online at globalspec.com for news and analysis of what's going on in the engineering sector, and also to access Engineering 360 webinars on demand. Thanks for joining us, and have a great day.